I thought it'd be good for us to have opening discussion around this whole issue of why leaders in critical roles in industry, and particularly key industries like finance, but also in government, need to have a well-rounded understanding of the sustainability challenge, which in the last few years especially needs to kind of move beyond the ESG field, which has become almost the safe place for most people to be in when they talk about sustainability, and expand to include a way of thinking about the issues from a systems point of view.
It is critical at this point. It really is. I think the biggest leadership challenge and the task for today's leaders is not one of steadying the ship or making incremental improvements while protecting the status quo. I think the challenge for today's leaders really is about leading change and leading very significant change. Economy-wide transition is happening. It's not yet happening fast enough, but it certainly will happen. That's not in question. We're hitting the boundaries of the laws of nature, and humanity will only come off worse there. So leaders don't get to choose whether or not change will happen, but there is scope to think about, to lead how that change will happen, how their organizations will respond and prepare for that. And I think that really does need system-wide thinking and understanding. The challenge, as I said, is not about how to keep going with business as usual and making incremental improvements and managing a little bit of risk in the margins. Given that you're working this, your focus is very much on system change. What's your view on why we need that shift from an ESG focus to a systems focus?
I mean, my view, and what I've repeatedly said in the last few years, is that the dangers of the ESG sort of focus simply is that it's focused on an attempt to portray an awareness of an issue against a standard template. And you don't have to go beyond either to do or to understand. And so I think the risk of the ESG sort of heavy focus is that people don't understand root causes. Why is it this way? So if you're a business leader, what we try and do is to get them to understand what is the nature of the footprint, and to use science-based and economic evidence to essentially then decipher whether those impacts are something that they are able to live with rather than just report on because they meet certain criteria. But my biggest concern is the lack of scientific evidence-based thinking that goes into simply reporting. Though if I'm harsh, I'll say there is an attempt to insert science into ESG, which I don't think is robust enough. And so I think there's a lot of the danger I'm concerned is the misleading nature of the reporting. And I know enough people now in business and leaders who are concerned saying we need to move beyond, but they don't have a framework because in a way they've hollowed out a lot of the expertise needed or never built that expertise because they invested in just the reporting. So this is why part of the systems thinking, but also in more simple language, understanding root causes. What's your business model actually doing? Can you simplify it to understand what the externalities are? And can you come to terms with whether we can live with those externalities beyond just compliance? But something you said that really got me thinking a bit. People don't get to choose. And the question is, when they don't get to choose, there's of course a bit of regulatory pressure. But what else do you think that is compelling or getting business leaders to understand they don't get to choose? Because what we do see is a lot of business leaders not actually knowing enough to even understand what the issues are, so almost not understanding what the choices are they're making, which can have negative impacts that are unacceptable both to their brand, but more importantly to society.
Yeah. Agree. So I suppose I see a lot of I'm going to say leading businesses, enlightened businesses that you're working with between a rock and a hard place. There are all of the underlying drivers, pressures, water stress, the symptoms of climate change, a whole range of physical impacts that are now being felt. the increased, of course, demands to disclose, new legal liabilities, social pressure and expectation. So there's a whole range of drivers. Employees care increasingly, so the ability to recruit and motivate talent is all in there, but the markets don't yet price it in. Yes, there's disclosure, but money's not yet moving at scale as a result of those disclosures, and there's not yet enough rigor around the substance of that. So it really drives some of those challenges that we see, which is constantly having to trade off sustainability and commerciality. It leads to greenwashing. It leads to, we hear a lot about burnout and frustration of people working in sustainability roles. It leads to setting long-term ambitions, but not really being able to deliver. And then we see this quiet pullback and, maybe we're not going to make it because we haven't really grappled with the challenge at the heart of this, that markets can work and could work, but they're not currently designed to work. So I think there's not enough recognition, as you say, of the real root causes of this. Too much focus on the symptoms. I think too much optimism that somehow will innovate, technology will solve all of this. So I think there's a real need for deeper understanding of the macro forces shaping societies and economies, analysis of the root causes, insight into what then the levers of change are. Where can we learn lessons from history, lessons from others? Where are the examples of what works? And then strategies that will enable businesses to build long-term value resilience. We need real business hats on this. We need commercial competitiveness to be unleashed here, and that requires markets to be changed in businesses' own interests. So there's definitely need for more education to build that understanding so businesses can ensure that they're resilient and effective, profitable in the long term.
Well, one thing I'm really interested in is this whole issue of, so why is it over 20 years, despite all the supposed global awareness, and despite all the, I'm even going to use the word rhetoric about this is the most important challenge, that polls and research done all over the world show that most business leaders do not yet understand and take ownership. And part of the reason I think, and I would be interested in your views, is because they are not held accountable enough. There's no actual large downside if you can keep doing the same thing within a short term. But the other thing is they've just outsourced it to people within the organization who have no power, but yet who feel that their jobs, whilst they have no power, is to essentially make sure that those who are in power are not fed the bad news. And so there is a sort of whole power distance and then the information gap. And that's been my experience of people I know, incredible positions in large companies, CEOs, who are, very good people, but they have outsourced the understanding and appreciation of this leadership challenge of our times to others, almost as a functional duty. And the others, with all due respect, don't feel they have the power to change anything. Do you see this dynamics playing out? Because it's one of the things I see playing out so loud and clear, and I try to speak about it as much as I can.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's an inevitable, like the delegating of it is an inevitable consequence of, there are no consequences, there are no particular rewards, there are no consequences of not leading on this. And I think that comes down to, we haven't designed markets for this. So if we take a long view, we had a real challenge of even persuading businesses that action on sustainability was relevant to them, that it had costs and impacts for them, that they had a role, that had a vested interest in addressing this. So there was a big challenge there. Then we had global agreement at Paris around climate. And at that point, there was a confidence that, somewhat misplaced in hindsight, that governments were going to get serious, that there would be a swathe of regulation and that businesses are better prepared for that. And at that point, it kind of didn't matter whether you believed in it or not. There was a kind of a movement around, look, governments are going to do it anyway, so get ready for that, because there'll start to be consequences. But we haven't seen enough progress there. And then we had the rise of a whole range of business-led activities, which I think many of which were well-meaning, but I think in hindsight not well-founded. That was a kind of business can save the planet. You know, there are trillions of pounds of economic opportunity here. You can do well by doing good. And I think some of that works while there's positive market sentiment, and that's where you start to see CEOs really leading on it when they believe that it's profit enhancing, it's, you know, profile and career enhancing to be visibly leading on it. And for a little while, we saw a bit of a virtuous circle there. And there have been, I think, some wins. You know, the take up of renewables has far exceeded some of the models. But we haven't dealt with, that hasn't been a strategy that's been effective in designing out the damaging activity. It hasn't stopped it being profitable to undermine nature, the environmental infrastructure. So I think that was only worked for part of the picture, and it sidestepped and enabled us, I think, to avoid dealing with the real challenge that we need to not just incentivize or reward the good stuff. We need to stop the things that are damaging. And I think, it's led to what I think was the ESG hype bubble. I know the FT brands that called it the ESG party, where we had this positive sentiment, but when it hit economic headwinds, when it started to have real costs and consequences, we've seen the limits of something that's based only in market sentiment. We need markets to be structured so there are consequences. If you don't meet your targets, there has to be a consequence. If you disclose really significant risks and negative impacts, money has to move. And we don't have that. So why would businesses really take action if they get punished in the markets rather than rewarded? So I think we need effective state action to make it possible for businesses to go beyond what they can do within short-term commerciality.
And one of the conversations I've been having in just the last year, in also leadership training, etc., that a business is not entitled to a profit, nor are investors. The profit or the return is essentially a social construct, and that social construct is the boundaries around which you can operate, your license to operate. And if your license to operate starts to narrow and tighten because of the impacts are not acceptable, then your profits will have to adjust unless you innovate in a new way. And I keep saying to people, your profits are not sacrosanct, it's a construct. I wonder what do you think about that, and whether we should be focusing on raising the awareness by saying you're not entitled to sacrosanct margins.
Completely agree. I think that's where a lot of conversations, particularly in board programs, in executive level programs, is really getting to the crux of this. We believe institutionally that we don't have time to completely reinvent institutions and ways to lead change at scales. We have to use markets, but markets need to work. And at the moment, they're not working. Our economic assumptions and models aren't working. And when you've got a tension between the laws of nature, of physics, chemistry, biology, and economics will come up worse. So when you're facing an economic argument that it doesn't work, then we need to find a way to change the economics. We can't change the laws of nature. So I think that really does need to be unpacked. I think there are a whole lot of associated, mindsets and myths. So that mindset of, we have to protect short-term commerciality, so we can only do as much as we can afford, puts not only that business, it puts entire economies at risk. We will not achieve what we need to and have a context in which we can do business if we only have the sum total of what each individual business thinks it can do without compromising commerciality. It's a very short-term, it's a very naive view. So I think we need to shift from defending the status quo when the status quo is part of the problem. It needs to be, how do we evolve the status quo to sustainably meet society's needs, to yes, use markets, to yes, seek profit, but through sustainable activity, not through the same old activity that might be profiting from undermining the planet and society, but looking for a few hero projects and good news stories. So I think it needs a mindset shifts there in a range of ways. And I think there are ways. We do need business innovation. We do need businesses to show what's possible. I think regulation will always lag rather than lead. But it's in businesses' own interest, not only to show what's possible, but to make sure their competitors have to bear the same costs of transition. I think we see a lot of businesses with also a mindset of more state action, more regulation is bad for business. But at the moment, the absence of it means that people have got to the end of the road. They've got all the win-wins. They've got all the low-hanging fruit. Action now will take investment for the long term. It's uncompetitive to bear that yourself if your competitors aren't also bearing it. So it's in your own interest to bring on that regulation and then prepare to compete at a higher level, really. To what extent do you think we need to completely transform, the economic system and markets? Or are we just talking about small tweaks? A really high proportion of people, I'd say up in the high 90s, recognize we need some fundamental shifts. Yet all of those people are going back into institutions which are basically carrying on with business as usual. So I would say there's a real dissonance within leadership levels. You don't get to be senior in business without, being really smart and knowing what's going on. And yet we are somehow trapped in constructs of our making. So I think there's a need to better normalize, to give space for people to not just keep going within a broken system now and then do something to give back once they're out of that system, but to find routes to be able to tap into the energy, the innovation, the momentum within a lot of quite senior and thoughtful people in business who recognize the need for change. So I think education can be a really valuable way to create and surface shared understanding. Quite often we'll have a group of senior leaders who'll say, well, I personally believe it, but I'm not sure my peers do. Giving a space to say, you know what, you all recognize this. You don't need to sit in despair. There are very practical, strategic things you can do as an organization to accelerate transition, to prepare for it, to position for it, to contribute to system change. So I think education has an important role to play to help address that dissonance that I think exists, that appetite to do something positive, but a sense of being trapped, and often each individual feeling they are uniquely trapped within a broken system. How do we get upstream and design out the root causes there? I think there's a lot of insight that we can bring around what are real practical levers of change. There are lessons from history that we can bring to the table that people can draw on. Not every organization needs to invent the wheel itself. There's a lot that can be learned there. But I think there's also a lot around not just the mindsets, but then the associated ways of leading. Addressing the perception you can future-proof the business in a broken system, that you can be future fit in an economy that isn't future fit. So how do you lead when actually you need your market context to enable it? You need others, you need whole sectors to shift. So what are the leadership strategies there? Where many leaders are effective at, extracting maximum efficiency and profitability where they've got, hierarchical or transactional power. You don't have that, and yet you need it to change. So I think different ways of leading is also a thing that we can help teams, individuals to reflect on. Well, there's a wider tool set and skill set that people can use than they've historically used to just optimize financial returns in a narrow sense.
Well, that's great because, I was going to share with you the view that we take, and through many years of working with large global companies, and particularly from Europe and the US, coming to Asia, which is a large market. And we can even touch on now the fact that Asian companies are going global the other way. But for the last 20, 30 years, it's been all of that. And the experience we've had is that many of these global companies see these issues as something that can be dealt with by just creating centers of excellence. The sustainability team working out of London or Munich or New York. And then let's have a satellite office in Singapore or Hong Kong to take care of that Asia-Pacific region. And not really understanding that the sustainability challenge, even from their particular industry, is very different as seen from the European or American lens as in terms of the impact. So we are of the view that these challenges are so big that companies actually need to look at this structurally from a very different point of view. They should not be having little sustainability experts in headquarters providing dictates and managing reporting. They should be building capacity throughout. And so that's why I wanted to share with you and seek your views on what we believe is an urgent need for organizations to build human capital that is understanding of these issues right through the organization. And the analogy, and you don't have to be a sustainability expert, but if you are aware right through the organization, whether it's a procurement manager, it's a plant manager in somewhere in Indonesia for a multinational company, they can see things, they can act locally, they can also innovate locally.
Absolutely. In fact, all of our work around leadership talks about leadership, not just leaders. So I think that, the time of relying on a few heroic leaders or enabling technical expert leaders to see it as their job to deliver it for the organization. I think there remains a role for people who are responsible for sustainability. That would be a separate conversation, but I don't think people in sustainability roles, I don't think their job is to transform the entire business. I think there is still a role there, and we should come to that if it's helpful, but I think we do need, this is just good business. It should be embedded across the organization. And for the reasons really you've outlined, the nature and scale of change that's needed will need changes in process, in products, in even fundamental business models. No single expert can deliver that. That needs the full business engagement. It needs everybody to really understand why and what's the strategy so they can be on board and play their role. As you said, there'll also be real insights, ideas into context-specific, market-specific innovations, changes that are needed. And where we see it coming up is often, there might be a very top-level commitment, there'll be a sustainability team, but people who are running serious parts of the business are sitting saying, actually, we don't have a plan. My team doesn't actually know what the strategy is and isn't well equipped. Commercial bankers, do they know that their client's business plan is robust? Is it really resilient in light of climate and nature risk? How would they know if what they're being presented with is good enough? Or supermarket supply chain manager, do they know that their suppliers are really resilient to, extreme weather events? Or corporate affairs teams, are they really effective enough in lobbying for, the infrastructure or the regulation that's going to be needed to enable the business to really take action, be competitive for the long term? So I think it needs people, every department has a really important role to play there. So I think it needs to be shift from being seen just as an expert domain to being seen as just good business.
How does one instill a culture of learning in organizations, given all the pressures? And in recent months, I've been having numerous conversations with large institutions, trying to get them to embrace our learning platform, GIFT.ed, etc. And I'm very intrigued when you get into an onwards conversation that people even at senior levels say, there's just no time. And then if they're more honest, they say, all we have time for is making sure people are trained in the things that gets this year's agenda met and this year's targets met, and equipping them with the knowledge they need for change with regard to those results. And so then my challenge to them is often, so you don't really have a culture of learning, you have a culture of essentially teaching to comply and meet targets. So I'm intrigued whether people like me are naive in believing that one should build a culture of learning across organizations, embed them, as you say, because this is the most important leadership trait you need. And leadership is not defined by the title, but the way people act right across. So am I extremely naive, or do you think there is a possibility that...
So I think we have institutionally shared approaches and views on what's needed, which is what makes the collaboration such an effective one and one that makes sense. So your analogy around compliance, I think really important. We have to make sure that there's that level of this is just the job. It's, the cost of being business is to do this. But I think that's not enough. And I think the real risks in looking only at this through a compliance lens. And I think some of the challenges we've seen, for instance, when we saw the work around climate-related financial risk, and that's what got board attention because there were real, liabilities, disclosure expectations. It should, and we really said, take this as an opportunity to think strategically for the long term. But inevitably, because of competing short-term pressures, it's tracked into we'll do what we have to do to comply. I think that in order to get the culture, it needs to start from the top. It needs to start from, is the leadership focused on long-term value, long-term resilience? And if so, equipping people with the learning, the insight, so that they can innovate to deliver that is really important. But if actually it's just we're just going to keep optimizing for the short term until we hit a barrier and we'll worry about that when we cross it, it's really hard to make the case for equipping people for something that the leadership isn't on board with. So I think while the leadership can't deliver it all alone, they do need to send a signal. We've chosen not to work with organizations sometimes where we felt that there's an intervention lower down, which has been, I think, really about meeting more junior demand and appetite to engage with sustainability, but are not a serious commitment at senior levels to really think about what does this mean for the core strategy and direction of the business, because then you'll just have frustrated people hitting internal cultural barriers when they come back with a sense that the business cares, and then it turns out actually it's just, no, get back to your day job. It was a thing to make you feel good about working for us. So I think it does need that buy-in at the top to say, we know we're going to have to change. Nobody's going to tell us all the answers, but let's set ourselves up with the best possible chance of innovating in a way, having an educated response. So we're, making the best choices that we can at each stage, even if we don't know what the right choice is. So I think it is a challenge. Ideally, businesses would be seeing the benefits of having made that education. They would be getting a kind of a short-term return on that. The challenge is some of these are long-term bets. We'll see the benefits in the longer term. So I think there's also a need for vision, holding your nerve, recognizing change is inevitable, not looking only at, well, did we see an increase in profits from education this year? It has to be aligned to a long-term vision and recognition of the transition that's coming.
It's really, really refreshing and to hear that you say that you have chosen at times not to work with businesses because you think, for the reasons you mentioned, it actually creates much more confusion, disillusionment, and it doesn't serve much purpose. I will give the last word to you in terms of anything you would like to add in terms of this conversation that people could absorb in terms of both what CISL does and its impact on the world and businesses at large.
I think there are two reflections. One is the importance of having spaces to have honest conversations and tell the truth. I think there's a whole ecosystem of consultants and organizations that in some ways have got a vested interest in protecting business as usual approaches. And that may well be well-intended, but ends up being part of the problem. And I think we need to be honest about how is our collective talent being deployed. And within, more populist, democracies and political processes, the space to be able to tell the truth and deliver honest messages has been narrowed. And I think that needs to be addressed by more people, telling the truth, more people creating spaces to have honest conversations, because these are challenges that face us all, and it's in all of our interest to get serious about this. And I think education has such an important role to play. We can change the world through people knowing more and making better informed decisions.